The dying race is a trope not unheard of in science fiction. Perhaps the oldest known use of the trope that anyone knows about is Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, the first third of which focuses exclusively on the decline and inevitable extinction of the Martian race. While most of the short stories in this section are pretty grim and tragic, there's one story that always struck me as kind of funny in a black humor sort of way. The story is about 3 astronauts from Earth who arrive on Mars and try to introduce themselves to the locals. But because in Martian Chronicles, all Martians have telepathic abilities and can make themselves see whatever they want, they just assume that the 3 men are Martians gone crazy and commit them to their equivalent of an insane asylum. The 3 astronauts eventually talk to the Martian doctor in charge of the facility, but he too just writes them off as 3 more head cases rather than being ambassadors from another world. Even after they manage to show him their rocket ship, he just believes that it's a manifestation of their delusional minds. Convinced that their cases are incurable, the doctor then promptly shoots all 3 men in the head. When the rocket ship fails to dissipate and the 3 bodies fail to turn back into Martians, the doctor comes to the only possible conclusion, that he himself is now incurably insane, and so he shoots himself in the head, and the story ends. Now, why would I start a video on the 40K Eldar with this kind of tangent? Simply because, like the Martians in Ray Bradbury's work, the fall of the Eldar, and believe me, you cannot talk about the Eldar without discussing the fall first of all, is also grim and even tragic, but from a certain point of view, is also morbidly hilarious. The story begins millions of years ago, when the Eldar were created by the Old Ones to fight the Necrons in Catan during the War in Heaven. As pointed out in my Necron video, details on the War in Heaven are scanty to almost non-existent. The Eldar themselves remember this conflict more as mythology rather than history. And so while we know that they were created to have psychic powers and fight against the Necrons, we don't know exactly what specific role they played during the war. All we really know for sure is that while all of the Old Ones' soldier races were created to have psychic abilities, the Eldars were by far the strongest. So when the war finally ended, with the Old Ones effectively extinct and the Necrons now hiding in their stasis tombs, the Eldar looked around and discovered that they were the new masters of the galaxy. Not only were their old creators gone, but since the Necrons had spent much of the war gathering souls for their Catan masters to feed upon, by war's end the galaxy had effectively been depopulated of sentient life. The only other race we know of that came through the war along with the Eldar were the Krork, believed to be the ancestors of the modern Greenskins. Still, while the Old Ones may be gone, they had left behind a legacy for the Eldar to inherit, namely their advanced technology, including the webway, and their knowledge of the warp and how it works. With these resources at their disposal, the Eldar swiftly subdued the Krork, driving them into the farthest backwaters of the galaxy, then set about turning the Milky Way into their personal paradise. With the webway, the Eldar could travel across the galaxy faster and in far greater safety than by using warp travel. With the Old Ones' technology, they created for themselves armies of robots so that they didn't even have to fight their own wars anymore. And with the Old Ones' medical science, they were able to extend their lifespans into the many thousands of years. Thousands of years that the Eldar dedicated to pursuing the finer things in life: art, music, and culture. And for tens of millions of years, it was bliss. Like the Old Ones before them, the Eldar were living as close to the good life as any race in 40K has ever managed. Even the Chaos Gods were of no threat to them in those days. Firstly, back then there were only 3 Chaos Gods, Nurgle, Khorne, and Tzeentch, and secondly, thanks to the knowledge imparted to them by the Old Ones, the Eldar knew how to actually contain the gods. Not destroy them, for the gods cannot be destroyed, but it was the next best thing. In my Chaos video, I talked about what it is exactly that fuels the Chaos Gods and gives them power, and I compared it to giving a starving man bread. Worshipping the gods in their true aspect, with their true names, knowing what they are, is like giving said starving man a whole loaf of bread. Worshipping the gods but under false names and without full knowledge of their true nature is like giving the starving man slices from that loaf. Meanwhile, the base emotions that the gods associate with, Khorne with anger, Nurgle with fear, and so on, is like giving that starving man the crumbs from that loaf. So how did the Eldar find a way to deny even those crumbs to the Chaos Gods? Well, the first part was actually in the creation of their idyllic empire. Granted, our only sources are from the Eldar themselves, and they love to trumpet just how great and wonderful they are and how great and wonderful their civilization was. But as far as we can determine, the Eldar lived lives of peace and plenty. There was no need to work, for their technology provided for all their needs. No one wanted for anything. There was no need to improve anything, and thus there was no desire for change, and so nothing for Tzeentch. All their wars were fought by robots. Among the Eldar themselves, there was no conflict, only peace, and so nothing for Khorne. But what about Nurgle? Nurgle is a god of death, and he feeds upon the fear of death. So how did the Eldar get around that? After all, everything dies eventually. This is where the second part of the Eldar's plan comes into play. Like the old ones before them, the Eldar understood that the warp responds to the desires and beliefs of sentient beings. This is especially true of those with psychic abilities, because they have a strong connection to the warp. And every Eldar was a psyker of one kind or another. They knew that if enough people believe something for long enough, it will become real. It's why 40k fans like to speculate that after 10,000 years of worshipping the Emperor as a god, humanity may have inadvertently, all without even knowing it, created a warp entity that is the God Emperor, completely separate from the essentially half-dead husk plugged into the Golden Throne. So, whether the Eldar gods were created by the Old Ones, as some sources claim, or by the Eldar with the guidance of the Old Ones, as other sources maintain, they were used during the War in Heaven as living weapons against the Necrons and their C'tan masters. And when the war was over, they were given another task, to keep an eye on the Chaos Gods. The Eldar gods would essentially keep an eye on them, while also maintaining the psychic barriers that essentially walled the powers of chaos away from the rest of the warp, where they could cause no harm. However, the Eldar gods were more than just supernatural gatekeepers. Like any good pantheon, each had his or her specific role in association with an aspect of Eldar life. For example, Asuryan was the king of the gods and associated with law. Isha was the goddess of fertility. Kurnos was the god of the hunt. Morai Heg was the prophet. Kegarak was the trickster. Vol the craftsman. And Cain the god of war. Still, their primary role was to keep the Chaos Gods contained. So long as they did that, the Eldar no longer had to worry about death, for when the Eldar died, their souls went into the warp. And with the Chaos Gods nicely penned away in their cage, the warp was essentially a nice, peaceful, guaranteed afterlife. What's more, if the spirits of the dead Eldar decided they want to take another crack at life, their living counterparts also had a method of guaranteed reincarnation. Thus, death was no longer something the Eldar had to fear, and so there was nothing for Nurgle to work with. Like I said earlier, the Eldar Empire at its height was as perfect as any society, fictional or otherwise, could possibly get. Perhaps too perfect. For as the eons passed and the Eldar kicked back and relaxed and congratulated themselves on conquering change, war, and death itself, they began to feel the faintest stirrings of boredom. Organic life, however powerful or advanced, is simply not meant to live in constant stasis. This is ultimately why, even if a perfect society was achievable, it could never last for long. Granted, the Eldar managed to make it last longer than anyone else. I mean, we're talking tens of millions of years here, but it was all doomed to end eventually. Although I'm sure the Eldar wished that their glorious empire had gotten a better ending than the one that actually happened. Anyway, the feelings of boredom grew stronger and stronger, and the Eldar soon discovered that they could no longer bear their perfect idyllic lives any longer. Initially, they staved off boredom by dedicating themselves to the arts, producing wonders of architecture, music, sculpture, etc. but eventually even these grew flat and stale. Finally, at some time between the 18th and 20th millennia by imperial reckoning, the Eldar took the first step towards their doom. Eldar physiology remains a matter of debate among the Magos biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos. What is known for certain, though, is that the Eldar nerve system is set up in such a way that their species feels both sensation and emotion far more strongly than any other race. So strongly, in fact, that the Eldar can all too easily become addicted to sensation the same way a human can be addicted to drugs. According to some sources, after their creation by the Old Ones, the Eldar were warned of the possible consequences of such addiction. But 65 million years had passed since then, and the Eldar had evidently forgotten this lesson, and so-called pleasure cults began to spring up around the Empire. At last, for the first time in so long, the Eldar had finally found something that could get their blood racing and their nerves firing. Forget purpose or meaning or profundity or even self-betterment. All that mattered now was sensation. Any sensation. The pleasure cults started out mostly harmless. Eldar would just get together and engage in drunken, drug-fueled orgies that wouldn't have been out of place on the average porn website. But as with all physical sensation, eventually the Eldar became desensitized to such erotic pleasure. Rather than fall back into bored apathy, the Eldar began engaging in even more extreme acts of lust in order to satisfy their addiction. And when that became dull, the Eldar began engaging in even more extreme sex acts, and so on, until, eventually, perhaps inevitably, they began to mix pain with pleasure. And the Eldar became the kind of sadomasochist that the Marquis de Sade would doubtless have approved of. But even that was not enough, and the Eldar just kept going and going until eventually they began doing things that even that infamous pervert would consider a turn-off. Every debased act and depravity was experimented with. If you can conceive it, the Eldar probably did it, and they probably did 24 things that you can't think of. And as the Eldar continued to plumb the depths of their newfound appetites, their once idyllic civilization began to fall apart. It got to a point where Eldar were literally murdering each other in the streets and then doing indecent things with the corpses for no other purpose than to get their rocks off. Social order broke down. The borders of the Eldar Empire grew weak. The Greenskins, long consigned to the backwaters of the galaxy, made a resurgence and began burning whole sectors in their fury. Things were just as bad in the Warp, as all of the pain and lust that the Eldar were feeling began to affect the Immaterium, and the psychic barriers containing Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch began to weaken. Warp storms broke out across the galaxy, rendering any form of travel other than the webway impossible. This isolation brought to an end humanity's first interstellar civilization, and marked the beginning of what became known as Old Night, or the Age of Strife. The Eldar, wallowing in indulgence, didn't notice, and even if they had, they probably wouldn't have cared. The Eldar had been the dominant race in the galaxy for millions of years, and with great power and dominance often comes arrogance and pride. What was humanity to the Eldar but a bunch of smelly, filthy Monkey, yes, that is their word, scrabbling in the metaphorical dirt? The Eldar had been sailing the stars when humanity had yet to leave the trees behind. Fortunately, not all of the Eldar had become slaves to their perversions. Unfortunately, these Eldar were too few in number to effect any change or stop what was happening. They could sense, however, that something bad was coming, that this could only end in disaster, and they decided that if they could not stop it, they could at least escape it. Some of these Eldar dissidents journeyed to isolated, underdeveloped worlds on the outskirts of the Empire. Still others hastily constructed continent-sized ships called craft worlds, and fled Eldar space as quickly as their engines could manage. The majority of the Eldar didn't bother to stop them. They simply didn't care. All that mattered was more lust, more pain, more stimulus. And at last, somewhere between M29 and M30, the disaster the Dissidents had long feared finally came to pass. For thousands of years, every iota of pleasure and pain experienced by the Eldar had poured into the warp, transforming it into the roiling hellscape we know it as today. Over time, all of that suffering, all of that desire began to take shape, to become something. And then, finally, that something awakened. Before the fall of the Eldar, there were 3 Chaos Gods. Now there was a 4th, Slaanesh, hermaphroditic god of excess and pain, dark prince of pleasure, known to the Eldar simply as She Who Thirsts. At the moment of its awakening, Slaanesh emitted a psychic scream that echoed across the immaterium. The psychic barriers holding back the other Chaos Gods shattered. Every being in the galaxy with psychic ability experienced intense pain. For the Eldar, with their greater sensitivity and their greater connection to the warp, it was a distilled agony unlike any other. And for the vast majority of the Eldar, it was also death. At the instant of Slaanesh's birth cry, they died instantly, their souls torn from their agony-twisted bodies and dragged screaming into the warp, where Slaanesh was waiting for them, ready and eager to, shall we say, play with his first victims, subjecting them to an eternity of suffering in a dimension where time has no meaning. The Eldar gods tried to subdue Slaanesh, but even newly born, the Dark Prince was simply too powerful, and all but 3 of the Eldar pantheon was annihilated. Kegarak the Laughing God is said to have disappeared into the webway and hasn't really been seen since. Isha, goddess of life and fertility, was spared only because Nurgle, god of death and plagues, took a liking to her and made her his captive. Cain, the war god, survived, though not intact. He was shattered into hundreds of fragments that later became known as the Avatars of Cain. The heartland of the Eldar Empire was consumed in the Cataclysm, and the entire region of space collapsed into a giant warp rift known to the Imperium as the Eye of Terror. Ironically enough, the birth of Slaanesh and the formation of the Eye put an end to the warp storms that had scattered humanity and caused the Age of Strife, thus giving the Emperor of Mankind his chance to unify humanity under his rule. Reduced and scattered as they were, the Eldar were completely powerless to stop the Great Crusade from sweeping across the galaxy. Funnily enough, though, this weakness was their saving grace. The Imperium was more than happy to slaughter them if they chose to stand and fight, but more often than not the Eldar preferred to run away, and the Imperium was more than content to let them go, figuring that they had bigger Xenos fish to fry, such as the Greenskins or the Frud. Even 10,000 years after the Horus Heresy, the Eldar remain a scattered and weakened people. They can't even replenish their numbers effectively. As they were the ones who created Slaanesh, the god of pleasure and pain has a certain hold on their souls. And to even have vanilla sex in the missionary position runs the risk of potentially kicking off the Fall of the Eldar 2 Electric Boogaloo. And speaking of Slaanesh, the Fall of the Eldar has given him a, shall we say, a taste for Eldar souls. Nowadays, if an Eldar dies, that soul is pretty much guaranteed to be claimed by the Dark Prince and subjected to torture rape for all eternity, if they're lucky. So far, the only way the Eldar have managed to avoid this terrible fate is to use artifacts known as Spirit Stones, which contain the souls of the Eldar when they die, and so long as the stone remains intact, the soul is safe from the attentions of She Who Thirsts. This is small consolation, however. For all intents and purposes, the Eldar are a race effectively doomed to extinction. And this really, really rankles with them. The Eldar may have lost their empire, they may have lost the majority of their race, and even a good chunk of their old knowledge and technology, but they have never lost their overbearing arrogance. To this day, even after torture-raping a chaos god into existence, the Eldar still act as if they are the best thing to happen to this galaxy since sliced bread. And when they happen to have a non-violent encounter with another race, very rarely, but this does happen, Don't they just love to trumpet about how great and wonderful they are, and just how beneath them the other races of the galaxy are? Of course, humans are the ones the Eldar dislike the most. Partly because they dislike the idea that some dirty Monkey now occupies the place of prominence that they once had, but the fact that they too are a civilization in decline is like a broken mirror image of the Eldar's fate, and they really don't like being reminded of just how badly they, not so metaphorically, screwed the pooch. The Eldar are perhaps the biggest example of someone taking the elves from Tolkien, the idea of a once mighty elder race now on the decline, and stripping them of any kind of self-awareness or acknowledgement of their failings, rendering them utterly insufferable and annoyingly arrogant. There are plenty of people who like to play as the Eldar in the tabletop game, but you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who genuinely likes them in the lore. Still, being few in number limits your options. And over the next 10,000 years, there have been many instances, no doubt involving much gnashing of teeth and biting of tongues, where the Eldar have actually made offers of temporary alliance to the other races, including the Imperium. In fact, they are the only race to do so apart from the Tau, and most of the time it's an alliance against a common enemy, such as Chaos or the Tyranids. Of course, when this happens, both sides are fully aware that these alliances are purely of convenience and that each side is using the other to further their own ends, and the Eldar wouldn't have it any other way. In modern 40k, the Eldar are divided into various sub-factions, but can be roughly categorized in two broad groups. The word Eldar is generally used to refer to those members of the species that are either trying to restore their lost glories and save their race from extinction, or those who simply wish to live in isolation and be left alone by the rest of the galaxy. The other group, known to the Imperium by the unimaginative name Dark Eldar, don't care about either of that and simply wish to keep on raping and torturing just like they did back before the Fall, and have garnered for themselves quite an infamous reputation as slave raiders, attacking underdeveloped worlds to acquire captives for their, amusement. The Dark Eldar are so different from their vanilla cousins, in fact, that they are treated as a separate faction in both the lore and the tabletop game. Funnily enough, if there's one thing the regular Eldar hate more than the so-called lesser races, it's the Dark Eldar, and trust me when I say the feeling is more than mutual. However, recent events suggest that that might be changing. A new faction called the Inari has arisen, taking in Eldar from both factions and from all walks of life. Their stated goal? Use the ancient forgotten knowledge imparted to them by the Old Ones to create a new Eldar god, Enid, the god of death, which they will use to destroy Slaanesh, thus freeing the Eldar from the threat of another fall and enabling them to restore themselves to their former glory. Before, this was only believed to be possible by sacrificing the souls of every single Eldar, both living and dead, which would be more than a little pointless. But the Inari, and especially their enigmatic leader Yvraine, claim that this can be done at a much cheaper price of life. If this turns out to be true, then it might just be the big break the Eldar have been waiting for over 10,000 years. Yvraine herself is also noteworthy for being the architect of the most recent alliance between the Eldar and the Imperium of Man, even going so far as to help revive the Primarch Rabute Guilliman. Once again, this is an alliance purely of convenience and mutual benefit, though for some reason that hasn't stopped plenty of artists from making some quite frankly heretical fan art concerning the true relationship between the Eldar leader and the Primarch. Still, between this, the possible return of other Primarchs, both loyal and Chaos corrupted, and the arrival of the Silent King of the Necrons, the 42nd millennium is turning out to be a most interesting time to be alive. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.